So you want to own a sports team, not a minor league club, not a semi-pro side that plays on weekends, a real franchise in a major league, the kind that shows up on television every single week. You picture the fun part immediately, the private box high above the field, the handshake at midfield before kickoff, the jersey with your name stitched into the lining somewhere nobody will ever see but you. Here is the strange part, and it is the whole reason this video exists. Almost none of these teams actually make real money from playing the sport. Some lose money every single year on paper, and yet the people who own them keep getting richer year after year by staggering amounts. The kind of amounts that have nothing to do with how many games they win. That is not a contradiction. That is the entire business model. And once you understand why, you will never watch a game the same way again. Most fans assume the price tag is the hard part of owning a team. It is not even the interesting part. In American football in 1989, an oil executive named Jerry Jones bought a struggling franchise for around $140 million. And that is where the real story begins. Not with the money, but with what you think you are actually buying, and why that first assumption is the thing the industry quietly breaks before you ever sign a check. Let us put a number on the dream, because the number is the point. In 1989, an oil executive named Jerry Jones bought a struggling football franchise for around $140 million. At the time, that team was losing roughly $1 million a month. People around the sport thought he had lost his mind. Today, that same franchise is valued at around $13 billion. Not because it wins constantly. It has not reached a championship game in 3 decades. But because of the structure underneath the entire industry, which we are about to walk through beat by beat. That $13 billion is the entry price for a legacy team, one already established, already humming, already inside the club. Here is the thing nobody explains to you at the start. You can almost never just buy your way into a league from scratch. You cannot build a new stadium, hire some players, and declare yourself a member of a top-tier league the way you could open a restaurant on any street corner in your city. The league has to let you in. And the leagues that matter, the ones with the television money and the global fans, only let new members in when they decide to expand on their own schedule for their own price. That single gatekeeping rule is what separates a sports team from nearly every other business on earth. And when they do let you in, they make you pay through the nose for the privilege of diluting everyone else's slice of the pie. Right now, a new team joining a major basketball league in an expansion city is expected to pay somewhere between $7 billion and $10 billion, just for the right to exist. That money does not build a single seat in a stadium. It does not sign a single player. It gets split among the owners who are already there as compensation for the extra mouth at the table. Think about that for a second. You could pay $10 billion and still not own a single player, a single building, or a single ticket. You just own a license to play. This is the first thing you need to understand about this business, and it explains everything that follows. There is no such thing as free competition here. Anyone with enough capital can open a second coffee shop across the street from the first one. Nobody can open a second version of a major league team in the same market without the league's permission. And the league almost never gives it, because a second team would split the fan base and shrink every check. Economists have a boring word for this. They call it scarcity. But scarcity that is created on purpose and protected by rule behaves less like a market and more like a private club with a members-only waiting list that never actually gets shorter. Compare it to diamonds, because the comparison is almost perfect. A diamond is not rare because there are only a few buried in the earth. It is valuable because the supply reaching the market is deliberately controlled by the people who dig them up. Sports franchises work on the exact same logic, except the supply is a fixed number of seats at a table. 30 teams in one league, 32 in another, and that number almost never grows no matter how many cities beg for one. So the first reason these things are worth so much is simple and permanent. There will never be more of them. But that alone does not explain why the value keeps climbing decade after decade, why a franchise bought for $140 million can be worth $13 billion a generation later. For that, we have to talk about where the actual money comes from. And it is not the thing you are picturing when you imagine owning a team. Ask a fan how a team makes money, and they will say tickets, jerseys, hot dogs, parking. All reasonable guesses, all mostly wrong. Those things are real revenue, but they are small and they are capped by physics. A stadium only holds so many seats. A season only has so many home games. You cannot sell more hot dogs than there are people in the building, and there are only so many buildings you can fill in a year. Meanwhile, the two biggest expenses in this business, player salaries and stadium debt, climb every single year, whether the team wins or loses, whether the stands are full or empty. So the gap between what game day brings in and what the operation costs can be razor thin, and sometimes it is negative. One elite European football club posted a pre-tax loss of over $260 million in a single recent season. Its parent company posted an even larger loss, north of $700 million, once you counted the enormous cost of assembling a roster of players. This is one of the most famous, most watched clubs on the planet, playing to sold-out crowds every week. And on paper in that year, it lost money on a scale that would bankrupt most companies outright. Its valuation kept climbing anyway, past $4 billion. That is the pattern, repeated across continents. A basketball franchise in New York posted an $80 million operating loss one year and a $34 million loss the next, while simultaneously setting attendance records. Then a small ownership slice sold for a price that valued the whole team at nearly $6 billion. So here's the question that actually matters, the one this whole video is built to answer. If the operation itself is sometimes bleeding money, where is $6 billion of value coming from? To answer that, we need to talk about the thing that quietly took over this entire industry: television and everything that came after it. Before broadcasting, a team's fortunes were tied entirely to how many people physically walked through the gate. That was the ceiling. Then television arrived, and the whole industry flipped upside down. A live game turned out to be one of the last things people reliably watch as it happens, rather than skipping ahead or catching later. Nearly everything else, shows, movies, even the news, gets consumed on the viewer's own schedule, on demand, whenever they feel like it. Live sport does not work that way. You watch it live, or the moment is gone forever. Advertisers will pay an enormous premium for that kind of guaranteed real-time attention, because genuine real-time attention has become rare and keeps getting rarer. That premium shows up in staggering broadcast contracts. American football's national television deals running from 2023 through 2033 are worth roughly $110 billion combined, split across traditional networks, cable sports channels, and streaming platforms. Basketball's national media package, covering the following 11 seasons, is worth somewhere around $76 billion, shared among a similar mix of broadcasters and streaming companies. Here's the part that should stop you for a second, because it inverts everything you thought you knew. That national money gets divided roughly evenly among every team in the league, largely regardless of how the team performs on the field. A team that finishes dead last in the standings still collects close to the same national broadcast check as the team that wins the championship. Your on-field performance barely moves this number. Your mere presence in the league is what moves it. Layer on top of that the local broadcast deals, where an individual team sells the rights to show its own games in its own region, and you start to see the real shape of the business. The game itself is really just the content that justifies the contract. The contract is the business, not the scoreboard. To keep that business stable, the leagues force teams to share. American football pulls all national broadcast money and splits it equally, and a little over a third of every team's ticket revenue goes into a shared pool divided across all 32 teams. Added up, and roughly 2/3 of the league's football-related income is shared equally, whether you are in the biggest city in the country or one of the smallest. A team in a tiny market collects almost the same check as a team in a giant one. Baseball takes a different approach, but the goal is identical. Every team contributes just under half of its local revenue. The money it makes locally from broadcasting, tickets, concessions, parking, into a central pool, which then gets divided evenly. That single mechanism moves more than $200 million a year from large market teams to small market ones, quietly subsidizing the little guys. Basketball pools half of what it calls basketball-related income and redistributes it to help balance weaker markets, though it does require smaller teams to hit a minimum revenue threshold first, so owners cannot simply collect a check without trying. None of this is charity. It is insurance. If small market teams go broke or become permanently hopeless, the whole league gets less interesting, ratings fall everywhere, and the big teams lose value too. So the rich teams subsidize the poor ones, not out of kindness, but because a healthy league is worth more to everyone than a lopsided one. Now the other half of the equation, cost. Player salaries are the single biggest expense, and if left uncontrolled, the richest owners would simply buy every star in existence. So most leagues impose a hard limit. American football's cap sits at just over $300 million per team heading into 2026, up more than $100 million from just 4 years earlier. Now the most controversial line item in the entire business, the building itself. A modern stadium can cost well over $1 billion to build. Here is the uncomfortable fact. Much of that money often does not come from the team owner at all. It comes from the public. One recent football stadium project came in around $2.1 billion, with roughly $1.26 billion, about 60% of the total, funded by taxpayers. Another came in at $1.4 billion with about $850 million in public money behind it. A third came in at $2 billion with about $750 million in public funding. How does a private business get a city to hand over billions of dollars? Leverage. Because there are only so many teams in existence, and every city without one desperately wants one. An owner can credibly threaten to move the team somewhere else unless the city builds them a new home. Cities afraid of losing jobs, pride, and television exposure frequently give in. Independent economists who study this outside the leagues have said for years these subsidies rarely deliver the broad economic boost that gets promised. Money spent at the stadium is usually money that would have been spent nearby anyway, at a local restaurant, a movie theater, a bowling alley. It does not multiply, it just moves. But for the owner, the stadium is not really about civic benefit. It is a private cash machine built substantially with someone else's money. Luxury suites, corporate naming rights, concerts, and conventions during the off-season. These revenue streams often belong entirely to the owner, sitting outside the revenue-sharing formulas we just discussed. In some cases, the real estate around the stadium eventually becomes worth more than the team playing inside it. Around one stadium in the American South, an ownership group built a 77-acre neighborhood from scratch. Hotels, apartments, offices, restaurants, a concert venue, anchored by the ballpark, but not dependent on it. The land underneath that development was worth around $5 million a decade ago. By 2022, it was worth roughly $736 million. In a single recent year, the district pulled in over 10 million visitors, and more than 7 million of them showed up on days when there was not even a game happening. They came for the restaurant, the concert, the office job, the hotel room. A basketball team in the American Midwest did something similar downtown, building out a 30-acre neighborhood around its arena and collecting rent from the shops and offices instead of just ticket revenue. This is the real shape of a modern franchise. A real estate and media company that happens to field a team. Meet Robert Kraft. Before he owned a football team, he was a paper and packaging businessman from Massachusetts who grew up going to games as a kid, and decades later bought season tickets in the worst seat in the stadium just to be close to the team he loved. In 1994, he paid a then-record price of around $172 million for the franchise, and with the surrounding land and the stadium lease, the full transaction came to about $227 million. People close to the deal thought he had wildly overpaid. Today, that same franchise is valued at roughly $9 billion, and a small minority stake alone recently sold to an outside investment firm at a price that confirmed the number. So how does a fan with no experience running a professional sports organization end up building one of the most valuable franchises on the planet? The honest answer has almost nothing to do with him personally being a genius at football. It has everything to do with timing. He bought in right as national broadcast contracts were about to explode in value, right before the salary cap era began stabilizing costs across the league, and right as the surrounding real estate near his stadium started to become one of the most valuable pieces of commercial land in the region. He did not outsmart the market. He was simply standing in the right spot when the tide came in. And the tide has kept rising for over 30 years since. Let us talk about what happens when that structure breaks, even briefly, because it has, and the numbers involved are enormous. In 1994, Major League Baseball's players went on strike over a dispute about salary structure, and the season simply stopped in the middle of August. The World Series, played every year since 1904, was canceled outright for the first time in 90 years. No games, no tickets, no local broadcast revenue, no concessions. For months, every single revenue stream tied to game day went to zero. While the fixed costs of running a franchise, stadium debt, staff salaries, long-term player contracts, kept accruing regardless. The financial damage ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars across the league, and it took years for attendance to fully recover afterward, because a meaningful share of fans simply stopped trusting the sport and did not come back right away. Here is the structural lesson underneath that story, and it applies to every league, not just that one. A franchise's most expensive costs are locked in years in advance. Stadium debt does not pause because of a labor dispute. Long-term player contracts do not pause either. But revenue can stop instantly the moment the league and the players fail to agree on how to split the money. When you own a team, you are never just betting on your own decisions. You are betting on billionaires and players keeping that agreement alive year after year. Let us walk through what a single year might actually look like for an established mid-sized franchise, using the kind of round figures that show up across the industry. Start with revenue. A typical team in a major league might collect somewhere around $200 million from its share of the national broadcast deal alone, largely guaranteed regardless of performance. Add local broadcast rights, ticket sales, concessions, parking, and sponsorships, and total revenue for a mid-market team might land somewhere between $350 and $450 million in a given year. Now subtract the costs. Player payroll, bumping up against a salary cap that recently crossed $300 million in one league, is easily the largest single expense. Add coaching staff, front office salaries, travel, insurance, marketing, and the debt service on a stadium that may have cost over $1 billion to build. Put all of that together, and operating costs for a single season can also land in the range of 300 to 400 million. That leaves a genuinely thin operating margin in a normal year, sometimes tens of millions in profit, sometimes close to break even, sometimes a loss, depending on injuries in the market. Now compare that to the franchise's value that same year. It might climb by several hundred million while the operating statement barely broke even. That gap is the entire business, condensed into one number. You are not really being paid for how well you ran the team last season. You are being paid for owning a permanently scarce slice of a growing media and real estate empire, and the operating statement is almost a footnote next to that. Picture it as a loop. You buy the team. The league's scarcity means nobody can dilute your position by creating a competitor next door. The media contracts get renegotiated every several years, and they have historically only gone in one direction: up. The neighborhood around your stadium keeps developing and keeps appreciating like any other piece of prime real estate. And because leagues behave like protected monopolies, they can pass rising costs straight through to broadcasters, sponsors, and fans, largely insulated from the economic downturns that would crush an ordinary business. The result is that franchise values have grown at rates that make most traditional investments look sleepy by comparison. Across the major North American leagues in recent years, average franchise values have compounded at somewhere between roughly 10 and 15% a year. That is not the return on ticket sales. That is the return on owning a permanently scarce asset that gets more valuable every time a new broadcast deal is signed, or a new billionaire tries to buy into a league that is not accepting members. This is also why owners almost never sell, even when they could clearly cash out for a fortune. Selling means paying capital gains tax on the appreciation and giving up an asset that keeps growing faster than almost anything else they could put the money into instead. Why would you sell the machine that keeps printing money just to go find another machine? And if the financial return can take decades to fully show up, why are billionaires still lining up to pay record prices? There are thousands of billionaires in the world. There are only somewhere around 150 franchises across the major leagues worth owning. That imbalance alone tells you something. Owning one instantly puts you in a room almost nobody else on earth can enter, no matter how much money they have. It buys influence a stock portfolio never will. A city that wants to keep its team happy will often bend on zoning rules, infrastructure spending, and tax treatment for an owner's other businesses. A luxury suite becomes one of the most effective rooms in the world for closing deals with nothing to do with sport. Ownership remains an extremely exclusive club. There is exactly one publicly owned team among the major leagues, and the league changed its rules specifically to make sure no other team could copy that structure. What has opened is a narrow lane for private equity funds to buy small, silent slices. No vote, no board seat, strict caps on how much they can touch. If you strip everything else away, a sports franchise turns out to be several different businesses wearing one jersey. It is a scarce, protected asset that behaves like a private monopoly. It is a media company that sells a live, unskippable audience to advertisers at a premium few products can match. It is frequently a real estate developer using a stadium as the anchor for a neighborhood that runs 365 days a year instead of just 10. And for the person who owns it, it is a passport into rooms of power and access that no ordinary fortune can buy on its own. The optimistic version goes like this: you buy an established team. The media deals keep growing on schedule. The surrounding real estate appreciates the way it has for 20 years. And a decade or two later, your asset is worth several times what you paid, even if the yearly statement never looked exciting. The harder version: you overpay in a hot market. A recession trims the advertising dollars. A labor dispute freezes a season and your local revenue with it, and the neighborhood takes a decade longer to fill than promised. In that version, you carry enormous debt on declining cash flow, waiting for the next media cycle to bail you out. The difference between those two outcomes usually is not the win-loss record at all. It is the health of the broadcast market, the strength of the real estate, and whether the league keeps its scarcity intact. Fans spend their time watching the scoreboard. The people who own these teams spend their time watching something else entirely. The next media rights negotiation, the next stadium deal, the next parcel of land.